Welcome to this week's episode of the Luke Alfred Show. As we've had in previous weeks, I have a guest, Ian Raystake. How's it, Ian?
How's it, Luke? Thank you for having me back.
Pleasure. You've got something interesting for us this week, a Gary Anderson special.
Yes, today I'm diving into a story about a South African abroad and, moreover, not even playing a sport that most South Africans are familiar with. He's a record holder in the sport and widely regarded as one of the best in his position to ever play the game. From Paris to Pittsburgh, we are discussing the epic career of NFL place kicker Gary Anderson.
Nice one.
Yes, the story gives me a chance to indulge in one of my irrational pleasures, gridiron football or American football, officially called the NFL or the National Football League.
Cool. And we're going to broaden things out a little bit after that. We won't give too much away here, but we're going to talk more generally about, let's phrase it delicately, big moments going awry in international sport, aren't we?
Yes, indeed.
Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show.
So to set the scene, it's January 17th, 1999. We're in the Metrodome in Minneapolis, and the Minnesota Vikings are at home taking on the Atlanta Falcons in the NFC Championship game. The winner will go on to Super Bowl 33 to face the Denver Broncos. Without getting lost in the weeds, 2 points are important to note at this stage. Firstly, the Vikings have appeared 4 times in the Super Bowl, but never won. And secondly, the 1998 Vikings are the best team in the league of that year, with a 15-1 record, driven by a ferocious offense that has swept almost all before them. With 2 minutes and 11 seconds left on the clock, the Vikings are leading 27-20. They have driven upfield and on 4th down have an opportunity to kick a field goal to go ahead 30-20. This will give them, according to analysts at the time, a 95% win chance for the game. Oh, and a third important point. The Vikings place kicker has not missed a kick in 2 years. In 1998, he is the first kicker in history to go through the regular season with a 100% record. No mean feat, as this includes 35 of 35 field goals and 59 touchdown conversions. And a third important point, the Vikings place kicker has not missed a kick in 2 years. In 1998, he is the first kicker in history to go through the regular season with a 100% record. No mean feat, as this includes 35 of 35 field goals and 59 touchdown conversions. 94 kicks without a miss. The kicker is a 16-year veteran, Gary Anderson, born in Paris in the Free State and schooled in Durban at Brettonwood High School. But before Gary lines up this 39-yard kick, let's see how he got to this point. First, a few important basic details for South African listeners about the National Football League structure. The NFL has 32 teams divided into 2 conferences, the AFC and the NFC. In each conference, there are 4 divisions, North, South, East, and West, comprised of 4 teams. A regular season at that time consists of 16 games, it's 17 today, where each team plays twice against its division rivals, home and away, and then plays a random mix of other teams across the NFL. At the end of the regular season, each division winner, along with a few wildcard teams, advances to the playoffs. This so-called postseason culminates in a championship game, yielding an NFC champion and an AFC champion who play each other in the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is not a home or away affair. The venue is chosen before the season starts. In fact, the next one, Super Bowl 59, will be played in New Orleans, home of the New Orleans Saints. One more gridiron football detail that is important is that teams generally have 2 kickers, a specialist punter and a specialist place kicker. These players are part of what's called special teams and only come on for very specific plays. They spend most of the game on the sidelines while the offensive and defensive teams conduct most of the action. That said, they are under a lot of pressure, of the you have just one job variety. Kickers are often game winners, and a few kickers have become famous for their walk-off heroics. Justin Tucker, currently the best kicker in the NFL, set an NFL record for the longest kick of 66 yards to win a game with 3 seconds left on the clock. And Adam Vinatieri has won 2 Super Bowls for the Tom Brady-led New England Patriots on walk-off kicks. Now, some with South African rugby lovers might remember an association between our rugby players and gridiron football particularly between Naas Botha and the Dallas Cowboys. In fact, you remember the pro from the early 80s. In fact, Naas only attended trials as a kicker with the Cowboys in 1983. He did not actually play for the Cowboys, and he also trialed with the New England Patriots. So he did not actually play any official league games in the NFL as far as I could see. One story I read made reference to a game where he and Gary Anderson were on opposite sides, but that must have been a preseason game if it happened. Naas did, however, play rugby in Dallas for the Harlequins club and helped them to a club championship in 1984. There are 4 South African-born players who have competed actively in the NFL. 2 others have made it to various NFL practice squads but have yet to take the field in regular seasons. Jerome Pathan played from 1998 to 2005 as a wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts, the New Orleans Saints, and the Atlanta Falcons. He's born in Cape Town. He went to high school in Canada and university in Washington. Drafted second round, which is pretty high for the NFL draft. I think it's the highest South African draftee. Scored a famous rugby-style touchdown for the Saints, which is now known as the River City Relay, where they actually passed the ball, which for fans of American football seems an unusual thing, but in rugby we know very well. And there are 2 South African-born players currently active in the NFL. Dieter Iserlin, born in Pretoria and schooled at Paul Roos, is an offensive lineman for the Houston Texans. And if South Africans want some sense of the physical size of some NFL players, Iserlin is 1.93 meters and 143 kilograms, which makes him heavier than virtually all professional rugby players ever. Finally, Greg Joseph, another kicker who was born in Johannesburg but left South Africa for Florida in 2001, has played for 5 teams in 7 years and is currently backup kicker for the excruciating New York Giants. Although given their offensive limitations and injuries, he's likely to step up to the tee quite a bit this season. He actually muffed a kick last night. One nice little coincidence is that Joseph also kicked for the Vikings and hit a game-winning field goal against his current team, the Giants, of 61 yards. And this is the longest successful field goal ever by a Vikings kicker. And finally, there's Gary Anderson. As I mentioned earlier, Gary was born in Paris before his family moved to Durban. His father was a priest and had also played professional football, this time of the English variety, though I couldn't find any details of his possible club affiliations. The story goes that soon after arriving in the US, Anderson is kicking these strange new balls. Despite their roughly similar shape, gridiron footballs are very different to rugby balls, and doing so particularly well. In one of those great moments of sporting serendipity, the high school coach at the ground who notices Anderson happens to be friends with Dick Vermeil, Hall of Fame coach who is then coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. At an Eagles tryout, Anderson is courted by several colleges before settling on Syracuse in New York because it allows him to carry on playing soccer as well. He scores 19 goals and letters in soccer at Syracuse before focusing on the gridiron. Anderson is taken low in the 1982 draft by the Buffalo Bills, round 7 and 171st overall. And just for listeners, the US sports in general have a draft system where weaker teams each year get a chance to choose the best college players coming out of college. And so there's quite a lot of activity around draft where teams make deals to move up and down the draft table. So drafting in the 7th round is quite low. Kickers generally draft very low. So he's taken 171st by the Bills. Another kicker is also drafted that year by the name of Anderson. The New Orleans Saints draft a Danish player named Morten Anderson in the 4th round. Hold on to that name for later. As often happens, particularly with special teams players like kickers, the Bills release Anderson in preseason before the Pittsburgh Steelers swiftly sign him as a free agent. The 13 seasons that Gary Anderson spends in Pittsburgh prove to be hugely successful for him. He makes the Pro Bowl 4 times, is elected as an All-Pro kicker once in 1985, and in later years is voted onto the NFL's official team of the decade. The Steelers are also in a rebuilding phase after a hugely dominant run in the late 1970s, so Anderson does not play in any championship games until his final season with the Steelers in 1994, where they lose to the San Diego Chargers. Anderson makes 2 field goals that day in driving rain, but it is not enough. Anderson's Pittsburgh career is stellar. He is the team's all-time highest point scorer by some distance with 1,343. He makes their all-time team of teams, and his number 1 jersey has not been reissued by the franchise since his departure 30 years ago. Anderson is released by the Steelers in 1995 and plays for the Eagles and the San Francisco 49ers before landing up with the Minnesota Vikings in that fateful year of 1998. It is worth noting that during this period, from 1993 to 2000, Anderson misses only 1 touchdown conversion kick out of 325. 1998 is Anderson's record-setting year in which he kicks 100% for the whole regular season. He's the first kicker to achieve this feat, and only one kicker since has done it by playing a full season. Anderson has joined a team that is also having a red-letter year. The Minnesota Vikings are 15-1 in the regular season. They have averaged nearly 35 points per game, top 3 offense of all time, and have the second highest points differential in NFL history. So that's the distance between winning and losing, the highest points and lowest points. Marshaled by veteran quarterback wizard Randall Cunningham and riding a filthy offense, including rookie phenom wide receiver Randy Moss, the Vikings are finally in a position to reach the top of the mountain. Though the Vikings are the first team to make 4 Super Bowls, they are also the first team to lose 4 Super Bowls, and they have blown golden opportunities regularly, often in agonizing last-minute circumstances. According to NFL Films, the Vikings are the second on the most snake-bit teams in history. Only the Cleveland Browns are considered more ill-starred. In their first divisional playoff, the Vikings blow out the Arizona Cardinals before hosting the Atlanta Falcons, who, though underdogs, have come off an impressive 14-2 regular season. The game is a tense affair with mistakes from both sides. Twice Minnesota get to scoring range but bungle the attempt, leaving Anderson to make 2 field goals. At halftime, the Vikings are 20-7 up and in a commanding position. After more missed opportunities, the Vikings look to finish off the Falcons at the end of the fourth quarter. Up 27-20, Minnesota drive to the Falcons' 20-yard line, setting up a 38-yard field goal attempt, who has continued his 100% clean into the postseason. Once more, a successful kick will push the lead to 10, all but ensuring the NFC title for Minnesota. Anderson hooks his kick wide left, giving the ball back to Atlanta with 2 minutes and 7 seconds left and new life. Minnesota still have time to save the game. They fail to stop Atlanta's next drive, which ends in a touchdown for Atlanta, tying the game. But the Vikings still have 40 seconds left on the clock to go for the game. For non-gridiron fans, 40 seconds is a long time. Atlanta fans will experience this to their cost in 2016 when they give up a 28-3 lead in the third quarter of the Super Bowl as the Tom Brady-led Patriots tie the game inside the last 50 seconds, pushing the game into overtime and eventually winning the Super Bowl. But rather than unleash their awesome offense for one last go, the Vikings run out the clock, forcing overtime.
Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story.
Now remember that other Anderson, the Dane, drafted in the 4th round by the Saints the same year as Gary, headed to Pittsburgh. Morten Andersen with an E. Morten and Gary have been dueling at the top of the NFL's points records for 16 seasons. After 2 more failed drives by the Vikings in overtime, the Falcons move upfield, handing a short field goal attempt to their Mr. Anderson. Morten nails his kick, sending the Falcons to the Super Bowl, and the Vikings back to Minnesota to mourn another near miss. The 1998 Vikings are widely regarded as the greatest team in NFL history not to make the Super Bowl. It's been 25 years since the miss, a trauma for football fans in Minneapolis that, if you're a South African, probably equates to the Duckworth-Lewis debacle at Kingsmead in the Cricket World Cup in 2003. But more sober fans will recognize that the Vikings had many chances to ice the game. Hall of Fame wide receiver Moss dropped a touchdown pass, Cunningham fumbled a snap in the 4th quarter, turning the ball over to Atlanta. The Vikings also dropped an intercept that would have killed the Falcons' drive prior to Anderson's miss. As one fan wrote years later, most people forget that we were still in it up until when he missed. They also forget that we won the coin toss in overtime and got nowhere. And amazingly, Anderson's miss is not the worst by Vikings kicker. In the Vikings playoff against the Seattle Seahawks on January 10th in 2016, in a game played in freezing weather, Blair Walsh was 3 for 3 on field goals before missing a game-winning 27-yard attempt in the 4th quarter with 26 seconds remaining. Walsh hooked the short attempt wide left, and the Vikings lost the game by a score of 10-9. Despite the agony, the Vikings stick with Gary Anderson until 2002. Even then, at the age of 43, Gary has 2 more years in him, this time with the Tennessee Titans. In fact, the story goes that Anderson, now 44, left a chart stream in Colorado in September to sign with Tennessee for one last chance at the Super Bowl. In a poetic moment in Tennessee's playoff win over Baltimore in 2003, Anderson kicks the winning 46-yard field goal with 29 seconds left on the clock. No comfort for Viking fans, but proof that Gary could still do the job at the highest level. An interesting note is that prior to his final season in 2004, the NFL outlawed the old-fashioned single-bar helmet in favor of newer, safer helmets. Anderson, however, was allowed to continue playing with his one-bar helmet under the so-called grandfather clause. And in another strangely coincidental moment, Morton becomes the Vikings kicker in 2004, the year that Gary ends his career in Tennessee. So in 2024, Gary Anderson is on the list of nominees for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, though given the competition, it is unlikely he will get his bust in Canton, Ohio this year. He is at least in the conversation, though, and one of his most vocal supporters is Morten Andersen, who won his spot in Canton in 2017. The top 29 leading point scorers in NFL history are all kickers, but there are only 2 pure kickers in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, which is one of the arguments why Anderson might win his spot, if not this year, then maybe soon. Anderson's career stats make for interesting reading. Over 23 seasons, his career field goal percentage is 80.1%, which doesn't get him into the top 25 kickers by percentage success. However, none of those kickers come close to the number of games Anderson played or the number of attempts made. Anderson comes in 13th in all-time touchdown conversion percentage at 99.2%, but again, his number of games played and kicks attempted is way higher than anyone else. Morten Andersen made 820 from 827 conversions in his career, which Gary Anderson made 820 from 827 conversions in his career, which is astonishing. Morten, the other Anderson, has more kicks attempted, but his success rate is 98.8%. And it's finally worth noting that Gary Anderson played most of his career for teams with outdoor fields, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, as opposed to domed stadia, which obviously reduce factors such as wind and rain for kickers. Morten Andersen, by comparison, played in domed stadiums for 20 of his 23 seasons. So that is the story of Gary Anderson, the South African that most South African sports fans probably don't know about, and his amazing career blighted by his one signal failure.
Thanks, Ian. What fascinates you about Anderson, the South African Anderson rather than the Danish Anderson?
Well, the one interesting thing is that the fact that so many kickers are not come from outside America, a lot of very good kickers. So there's Morten Andersen, Gary Anderson. There's a Korean guy kicking very well at the moment. There's an Aussie guy punting in the NFL. I think what's interesting about Gary is that it seems in a way, it's because it's very specialist, he just seems to be the right guy at the right moment. It's a serendipitous moment. He's hoofing balls around a field with no intention really, I think, of playing gridiron football, and turns this moment into this unbelievable career. 23 seasons, I think, in total. It's an extraordinary career. One of the top point scorers in a game that he probably would never have thought of playing. And I think that's what's so strange about it, is that it isn't like a kid in South Africa who dreams of playing for the Springboks or dreams of playing cricket for South Africa. He's a kid who wants to play soccer and ends up being one of the most successful players in another sport. And I think that's part of what's interesting about him, and the fact that he has this one poetic moment that I'd always heard about him because of the missed kick, but I never really looked into the fullness of his career and the fact that he was so consistent for so long, particularly with Pittsburgh before that. So I think he's not the most charismatic figure, I think, in terms of there's a lot of big characters in the game, and kickers really seem to be a couple of eccentric characters, but he's not a big ego sort of character. But I think I've always been fascinated by players who accumulate stats, who just have these long careers of just consistent productivity. And I think in one sense, he's like one of the sort of poster children of that. So, yeah.
It's always interesting to me how in these stories, there's a bit of that in the narrative arc of these stories, wherever they go, whether they go to success or they go finally to failure or a combination of both. There's always a moment along the way in the narrative arc of what you call the serendipitous moment, which is you're not necessarily doing at that point what you turn out to do. He was playing soccer. He turned out to be a gridiron kicker, place kicker, and there are these moments in other sporting stories, like you arrive, Stephen Larkham.
Yes.
Stephen Larkham always used to say, my dad took me to watch rugby, and even when I was young, 14 or 15, I made sure to take my boots, although I was a spectator, just in case there was an opportunity for me to get onto the field. And I can't bring any cricketers to mind, but there are cricket stories. I got taken along by my parents, or I always used to serve drinks. I was too young to play, or I was the 12th man, or whatever it was. And then suddenly someone gets injured, they tweak a hamstring, you get onto the field, you make an impression, and you never lose your place.
Yeah. I mean, there's again, maybe in gridiron, the obvious example of is Tom Brady. You know, he's now regarded as one of the greatest players ever, drafted last, 199th overall in his draft year, and not seen to be a particularly promising player. I mean, they love reading back his report card that says he's too slow and he's tall and he doesn't have athletic ability and his arm's not strong and all these knocks against his ability. He gets an opportunity early when the first choice quarterback goes down, and that's Tom Brady for the next 20 years. Plays quarterback until he's 45 years old, wins 7 Super Bowls. You know, and there's a player at the moment playing for San Francisco called Brock Purdy, also drafted 199th. They call him Mr. Nobody. Mr. Irrelevant, I think is his nickname. And he's now been quarterbacking for 2 seasons for San Francisco after they went through 3 quarterbacks. And all of a sudden he's there and he's like the guy. And
Mr. Irrelevant.
Mr. Irrelevant is now got to almost to the Super Bowl. You know, he's not irrelevant at all. So there are these kind of, I think why it happens perhaps in games like in some American sports, baseball maybe as well, is that because some of the positions are so specialized, it's not like rugby maybe where, you know, players need to have a wide skill set and they might play in a variety of different positions. So players like a kicker or a quarterback, you're not going to suddenly do something else. There are very, very few players who are cut out to play multiple positions. Maybe when they're at high school, by the time they get pro, you're doing one thing. So the opportunity for filling a space that opens up, I think, is much more acute in football than perhaps in other sports where that kind of serendipitous quality, you know, the water boy comes onto the field and turns out to be a pro. Yeah.
So I've done a little research into the yips. Okay. And one of the things they say about the yips is invariably it happens to sportsmen or women who have to start off. So in other words, batsmen don't get the yips because they're receiving the ball. It happens to servers in tennis. It happens to putters in golf. It happens to snooker players. It's happened to Stephen Hendry. And in actual fact, for a little bit of history, the phrase the yips was attributed to a Scottish-American golfer called Tommy Armour, okay, at the 1927 Shawnee Open, in which he took 23 shots to play a par 5 17th hole. And his definition of the yips was a brain spasm that impairs the short game. So very interesting. What we've got here is now we can bring this back to Anderson. Anderson has he has the weight of expectation there. He has the mounting existential dread at a time which is pretty touch and go for the Vikings. He has to initiate.
Yeah.
There's something there, isn't there?
I think there's 2 weird things about that. One of them is when you watch the kick, I mean, I don't want to throw Gary Anderson under the bus. And Gary, if you're listening, brother, like what an amazing career.
No, Gary, actually, he's being excessively polite and we'd love to throw you under the bus because our listeners will enjoy that far more.
But when you watch the kick, I think he doesn't believe he's missed it until he's missed it. It's not like he hits it and he knows he squaffed it. I think he looks at it and it doesn't miss by a huge amount.
Okay.
And I almost think
so it's quite close.
He can't believe he missed it.
Right.
And I think literally players talk about afterwards how they were already walking down the tunnel, getting, you know, and then one guy says, and then I heard the crowd tone change and I turned back and Gary Anderson's guy who hadn't missed in 2 years has missed the kick. But the other interesting thing, going back to your point about the yips, is I think what makes it different in that sport is in rugby, when you're taking a conversion, you have the kicking tee. Even though you're at different angles and so forth, you've got time. In gridiron, there's a very limited time. The ball gets snapped by a long snapper. It has to get positioned by the holder, and you're kicking off the ground. So once the play gets initiated, it's like all systems go because you've got guys running at you trying to block the kick. You know, you don't have time. So it's very much automated. You literally run up, you go through your paces.
It's not as temporarily, it's not as easy.
It's very different. So I think I almost feel like it's not complacency, but I think he doesn't expect to miss. And he just misses. And it's not like I think he even has a bund of nerves because, I mean, the next season he's going back to his old stuff. appear to impair his performance, he goes and plays 4 or 5 more seasons with other teams and kicks brilliantly. But it is a weird thing at that moment. Like it's almost like the crowd. It's almost like that idea of the side being snake bitten, as the NFL calls it. It's the curse, and it's going to come where I think what's more interesting about these sports stories is this notion of some sides being cursed. That no matter what happens, something will come and disrupt the perfect season or the perfect game. And for Minnesota, it's like, of all the things that go wrong, this is the one thing that they didn't think would go wrong, and so the curse comes back. And
do you believe that kind of thing? I mean, you wouldn't have said 10 years ago that Manchester United were going to be cursed. You would have said exactly the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what's interesting with teams is that teams have long teams with long histories as opposed to new teams. So Man United, Minnesota, one of the oldest of the franchises, going back to the 60s.
Because so I'm sorry, interrupting you, but the terrible thing about the curse is as a kind of a media conceit.
Like Boston Red Sox was the most famous curse in sport. It was like 100 years.
Yeah, but the statistical argument might be, on balance of probability, how many sides are actually going to win major tournaments?
Yeah.
Only one a year. So statistically, you could still argue that the Boston Red Sox have done better than the majority of the sides who play in their leagues. So the curse becomes a retroactive way to keep the curse going.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing about the curse. The people who impose the curse on the sides never actually analyze their role in the creation of the curse.
And I think it's cultivated by fans. It's a culture. It's more than it's not the players.
Absolutely. And I suppose you have to sort of rationalize it out, and you have to find a way to sort of deal with your terrible disappointment that your side hasn't won yet again. So it becomes, and then it becomes a kind of magic thinking kind of superstition.
And we both know,
doesn't it?
Yeah, and we both know that losing isn't about, that's the whole thing about sides often win as many games as they should win. It's just, do they win the important ones? So you might have overall your record might be fine. The Boston Red Sox, the Minnesota Vikings, if you look at their overall record, wins and losses, they are winning as many games as you would think for a franchise. They just lose the wrong ones. And so that idea of losing big games is often like, when you look at the stats in a sort of cold, impartial way, they actually win fine. They win enough. They just don't win maybe key games.
And the thing about big games is big games are magnified in the season, and therefore they're magnified in the memory.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't, at the beginning of the season, you go away to Sheffield United, and you come back with a very, very handy 3-0 away win. No one remembers that game.
Yeah.
But they do remember the game against Arsenal played in May, which you needed to score 2 in order to win the Premier League title. So, memory is a strange thing. The one thing I wanted to ask you about Gary Anderson is the soccer connection.
Yes.
And the relationship between technique and what he does in gridiron. Yeah.
It seems that
football technique, kicking technique.
I mean, it seems that in the early days of gridiron football, kickers were often multi-skilled, so they weren't kickers only. So they often played either offense or defense as well. So they were multi-skilled. I think George Bland is one of the famous ones, and they also had their kicking style was kind of toe on, or like a toe poke or a toe punt kind of approach. So they would run straight onto the ball and kick through the ball.
They would approach it directly rather than around the corner.
Yes. And that's often now referred to as the soccer style in America, when you approach from the angle and you kick in a way approaching from an angle. Yeah. They have very short run-ups because there's no time. So most kickers take like 2 steps at most. It's not like in the old days where I think it was David Russ, one of the South African kickers, used to have a long run up to the ball.
The Mike Proctor approach.
Yeah, in gridiron you have 2 paces, 3 paces, and then that's it. But I also think the technique...
After it's snapped, you can't
like,
be caught.
It's split seconds, yeah.
Yeah.
So the kicking style seems to be... I mean, a lot of kickers who've succeeded have come from different kicking traditions. Gary's one, Morton was another one. There's an Aussie kicker doing really well with punting at the moment in league, which might be because he's got experience punting in Aussie rules, so he's got his ability to kick very high hanging kicks with great accuracy. But I think for the place kicker, it's a very particular style of kicking that changed, I think, around about the early 70s, and so the sort of football approach has now become the standard approach for most kickers, where they approach from the side. And I think what is interesting is that the guy who's doing really well at the moment is also in Dallas, I think, is also a soccer. He comes from a soccer background. So it might be that soccer produces a particular a way of also approaching the ball in different conditions. So being able to move the ball, quite often if it's very, very windy, for example, you need to be able to kind of get the ball to fade or to draw in different conditions. So it isn't just a case of banging it straight down the middle. Even though a lot of teams are playing in domes where you don't have those windy conditions, at some point they're going to play out of doors, and because it's winter, they will play in inclement conditions. So being able to kind of like control or craft your kick, maybe I think is really, really important, as opposed to just, going for distance every single time.
Has there ever been any sense, or have you read anything from Gary Anderson himself which talks about this myth?
He talks about it. I mean,
how does he make sense of it? How does he rationalize it?
I think he's quite phlegmatic about it. Okay. I mean, there's a lovely shot. I mean, one of my favorite photographs is a picture of him and Morton, one of those signed kind of player cards of him and Morton meeting in a game where Gary's now playing for Tennessee and Morton is now playing for the Vikings.
Right.
And the two Andersons have this kind of moment. So I think if he was one of those kickers who had like a short career and this was his one chance, and he gets kind of basically drowned in ignominy for missing the one kick, it would be different. But he also, I mean, he's not even, he's more widely regarded by Pittsburgh fans because he was a Steelers kicker for 12, 13 years before he even goes to Minnesota. So, I mean, I think he has such a successful career before that. And then he kind of comes back afterwards with a different team. And maybe it's because of a lot of kickers change franchise a lot. It's unusual for kickers to stay with one franchise for a long period of time. Tucker at the moment, who's the big kicker, has been with Baltimore forever, but a lot of kickers tend to move. Greg Joseph's been with 5 teams already. So I think that idea of being like wedded to a town or to a club or to a franchise and to a fan base perhaps isn't the same. And by all accounts, every interview I've seen with him, in the rare instance, he did training videos for a while. You can find these old training videos on YouTube of Gary Anderson showing you how to kick, and he seems like a very earnest, sort of serious fellow. But it doesn't seem to have. It isn't like his career ends and he kind of never kicks again. Has a kind of breakdown. He gets back up the next year, carries on kicking, and has another 4 years of his career. So I mean, I think he survives that. I'm sure if you asked him, would you prefer to have a Super Bowl ring? The answer would be yes. But I think that at least within the context of his whole career, it's a blip that is kind of maybe outweighed by his other achievements.
What happened to Morton then?
Morton retired. Morton and Gary dueled it out for the 2 years after that game. And I think Morton retires the same year. They're even born, I think, within 8 months of each other, and their careers literally overlap pretty much precisely. They both retire around about the same time. Morton ends up a bit ahead of Gary on the points table, but they end up literally being the two Andersons at the top of the NFL points. And I think they still are. Maybe Adam Vinatieri's got close, but the Andersons are still pretty much 1 and 2 or 2 and 3.
Is Morton Anderson a Hall of Famer?
Yes.
So
Gary isn't.
So what's the justification? Can you assume what the justification for that decision?
The interesting thing with Morton is I mean, that's one of the complaints about Gary not being there, and why Morton's argued so strongly for Gary to be there, because their records are so similar.
Right. And
perhaps Morton doesn't have that one. He doesn't have that one glaring error. His percentages are pretty much the same. I think he's got slightly more kicks attempted and slightly more games, but I mean, statistically they're very similar. I think if I remember correctly, Morton does have a Super Bowl, and I think often when they look at Hall of, when they are evaluating players, So one of the big concerns this year is like Eli Manning's been nominated, and even though he's not regarded as a particularly brilliant quarterback, he won 2 Super Bowls. So his career stats are actually quite okay, or they're okay. But he has 2 rings, which is unusual. And I mean, for players to get 1 win is a big deal. So Manning's won 2 Super Bowls. So he's widely regarded to be. It's his first year of eligibility, and he's probably going to get in.
Are you of the school of big players to truly stand the test of time must have won things?
No, I'm not actually. Because
I tend to be.
Yeah, I think there are great players in you can reward, for example, players who've shown great loyalty by sticking with a franchise for years and performing really, really well. And even though that franchise or that team or that club never wins, I like the idea that this was a player that played for a team, for a community, for a fan base with great commitment for a long period of time. And then whereas you might get another player who changes clubs pretty much in order to win it, in order to win. It might be different for solo sports, like a tennis or a golf, where a player might be. I remember Ivan Lendl, for example, when I was a kid. I loved Lendl. And every year he'd get to Wimbledon, and every year he would soldier through to like the quarters and semis or the final. And every year he'd get beaten by Stefan Edberg, or like a young Pat Cash would come out of the woodwork out of nowhere and beat him in the final. And there'd be another year with Lendl. And Lendl's largely forgotten now. And yet he was one of the dominant players for a long period of time in the late 1980s and early 90s.
And you haven't slightly defeated your argument by saying Lendl is forgotten.
Well, I think in the solo sports, right. I think in team sports, I can admire a player who shows that commitment over time to a franchise, even knowing that the team, in gridiron football, Barry Sanders, one of the greatest running backs in the history of the game, played for Detroit for a terrible team for years and years and years. And his stats were outlandishly good. And he's an astonishing player to watch. But he plays with Detroit, and Detroit just don't win. So he's every time they pick a team of the century, he's always one of the first players they pick. But he didn't win anything, So there are those kinds of players who sort of fit in that position, particularly in team sports. I can't think of anyone in rugby, I suppose, or because we've been quite successful recently. But maybe Tiaan Strauss felt like that for me, in a way. Tiaan Strauss was one of my favorite players growing up. And I never felt he never quite got into the Springboks. He played for Australia when he left South Africa, and he was a fabulous player and an amazing servant of the game. And yet, in a way, he didn't win the big. He was almost there in 1995, but didn't quite get into the team. He was always there and thereabouts without really ever kind of capturing the moment.
And that was because Kitch was worried about he was worried about a north-south divide running through the middle of the team. And he sort of plumped Francois Pienaar.
But also Strauss was short. He wanted a taller, he had Jannie Brett in his mind, and eventually picked Mark Andrews in the final. And Strauss was a slightly shorter, burly, like a tackling hitman, but not renowned for like line-out work or anything else. And I think Kitch saw that as being a key component of us winning the 95 World Cup.
But there was some looking back, there was some we are going down a rabbit hole. Robbie Brink was chosen in the Springbok squad for the 1995 World Cup.
I remember watching him play when I was at varsity. Yeah. No. So a lot of this, So I think the point about it is a really important debate about whether greatness is defined by honors, and even the whole thing in American sport particularly is very, very grandiose, and the idea of having your bust in a Hall of Fame and a gold jacket and like having the green blazer or whatever it is at Augusta, they love the pageantry of rewarding these kind of great players. And maybe because that whole American mythos is around how great players change a team or change a circumstance. The English model, I think, is often a little bit more humble. The idea is that, that like you play for the team. So I think there's a certain amount of pageantry attached to the American debate, and it's often about who's the GOAT or who's the greatest in their position, and that kind of debate is often there literally to stimulate fan bases to put in their claim for their player.
It is very interesting in the team sports. You look at, say, the Portuguese golden generation as a football side. Well, you look at contemporary England under Gareth Southgate, 2 European Championship finals, what do you say?
Well, I'll give you a great example. Yeah. Last year, so South Africa wins the second Rugby World Cup. They have a list, IRB has its list of its players of the year, no South Africans. And everyone's like, how can you not have Eben Etzebeth as one of your players of the year? How can you not have Khaleesi or whatever? Answer is, from a lot of pundits from other countries, is that they don't play enough because they get subbed off. Because Rassie's whole thing about the way he uses his bench is to play those players for 60 minutes. So the one guy who has to be in the conversation this year is obviously Peter Steff. But even the argument which is going at the moment is that Oxenche should definitely be a candidate for Player of the Year. But even in his case, he very seldom plays a full game. So the idea is that because they're playing for the team, and the whole notion is that Rassie has produced this ethos where players know they're going to get subbed, and they don't mind it because they're part of a team dynamic. The downside of that is that when it comes to rewarding individual excellence, those players maybe don't get a look in. It seems to me ridiculous that Eben Etzebeth wasn't in the conversation for Player of the Year last year because he's immense. But that's one of the arguments against it, is because there's such a dynamic of team spirit and team kind of collective effort in the way Rassie coaches the team. The players don't play, whereas a guy like Ardie Savea will generally play a full game, or Josh van der Flier.
How Eben Etzebeth can be criticised for, he had half the French side hanging on his back.
Yeah.
He scored that try against...
No, I mean...
Yeah,
and I think this year maybe they'll look at it because he has played a lot, so he's played a lot more. But that's a really good example of how the way Rassie sees it, the team wins the Rugby World Cup.
Sure.
And even if individual players don't get the
what's the if Gary Anderson decided to make a guest appearance, knocked on the door, introduced himself, said he wasn't offended by anything you said, and you had one question to ask him, what would it be?
Wow.
But you have to preface it with Mr. Anderson, by the way.
I kept on thinking that this whole program had a bit of a Matrix quality.
Here comes Gary now, actually.
I actually had originally as the Mr. Andersons realized that in a Matrix, of course, it's Mr. Smith. It's Agent Smith, all the Agent Smiths are around. But he does say Mr. Anderson.
Okay, so what's the question?
I feel the question for Gary would be something around... was there ever a moment in his career where he imagined doing anything else? Like, he's 10 years into his Pittsburgh career, and does he stop one day and think to himself, I was born in Parys and I went to school in Durban?
He doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who would wake up in the morning and say, shit, I could have been...
I don't know. I mean, I don't...
A neurophysicist.
No, not that so much. But like, as a guy who clearly had sporting ability... I suppose it's the same question I often think about back in the day when you will remember this, when we used to have like dual sportsmen. So Herman Grobler played rugby and cricket for Northerns.
Yes.
And certain Errol Stewart played cricket and rugby for Natal.
Yes, was the centre for Natal, yeah.
And when I was at school, Herschel Gibbs was playing rugby and cricket for Province. And
Peter Kirsten
was another one.
Played fly off.
And so Herschel trialed at I think Tottenham or something. You always wonder, like, that sliding doors moment. What if you were went the other way?
Yeah.
And I think with Gary, like, is that I don't know. I don't know enough about his story to know just how serendipitous that moment was when he was kicking balls at that high school. Whether it was something that he was consciously aiming for, whether it just happened the way it's sort of the poetry goes. But I do think to myself, he must have thought of himself as having an unlikely career. And did he ever reflect on that? Did you ever for a moment think, I could have been playing football in like the UK or...
I always feel with the majority of sportsmen that excessive reflection is very dangerous.
Or it's not. Maybe
it's not to be disparaging. I think that's what makes them... Because I think...
Because you compartmentalize.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can, the best batsmen in the world aren't bothered by, playing and missing 3 times in an over.
Yeah. And I think the good
players... Not that happens very much in white ball cricket anymore.
Yeah. But also, they also know the good players, I think the mark of good players is their ability to have those kinds of errors and then to kind of like readjust, like recalibrate, get back to doing
it. And forget them.
I was very impressed on that note with Sasha Feinberg Ngomazulu doing a couple of times during the rugby championship where he had that spectacularly awful kick conversion attempt in the one game. The very next move and gets up, beautiful touch finder, gets back in the game, throws a pass, and like it never happened. Sure. And that ability to kind of recover is, whereas a guy like Hafi du Toit, who I loved as a player, just never quite got over, in a way, the yips. I think he struggled and he just never kind of got it, despite the fact that he was an amazingly talented rugby player. And other players, they just seem to deal with it.
Yeah.
They get rid of the yips.
They do. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Luke.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.